What happens when a man who has spent decades protecting other people's reputations finally decides he's done protecting yours? Not when the cameras are rolling, not on a red carpet, not in a headline, but quietly, privately, with one sentence that changes everything. She stiffed me on my money. Let that sit for a moment. Because when that sentence is whispered about someone connected to royalty, Hollywood listens. And when it's connected to a name like David Foster, people stop what they're doing and lean in. Now here's the part that should immediately make you uneasy. This wasn't some random businessman. This wasn't a distant acquaintance. This wasn't a tabloid villain looking for attention. This was someone who had every reason to stay silent, and every reason not to burn bridges. Yet somehow, those bridges burned anyway. So let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. How bad does a situation have to get before someone like David Foster decides to cut ties completely, not just with one person, but with an entire royal orbit? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because people like him don't walk away lightly. They don't explode publicly. They don't leak stories to tabloids. They disappear. And when they do, it's usually because something crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. A line involving trust. A line involving money. And according to whispers that have circulated for far longer than most people realize, a line involving a promissory note that was never honored. Now, before anyone rushes to conclusions, let's slow this down. This story is not about gossip. It's not about hate. And it's not about tabloid fantasy. It's about how elite relationships actually work behind closed doors, and how they fall apart when expectations quietly change. Because here's the uncomfortable truth no one tells you. At the highest levels of fame, money doesn't move like it does for the rest of us. There are no Venmo requests, no awkward reminders, no angry texts. There are conversations, assumptions, handshake understandings that carry more weight than contracts. And when one side believes a promise has been broken, the fallout doesn't happen loudly. It happens in silence. And silence, in powerful circles, is deafening. Let's rewind. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle stepped away from royal duties, the world saw freedom. But behind the scenes, insiders saw something else entirely. Uncertainty. No palace machine. No guaranteed funding. No lifelong structure. And when that kind of safety net disappears, something else rushes in to fill the gap. Connections. Hollywood connections. Music industry connections. Power players who know how to open doors, smooth transitions, and quietly support people during high-stakes reinventions. That's where David Foster enters the picture. A man whose entire career has been built on trust, on discretion, on being the person you call when you need something handled quietly and professionally. And this is critical. David Foster does not need favors from royalty. He does not chase relevance. He does not attach himself to chaos. People come to him, not the other way around. Which is why the early days of this relationship felt, to outsiders, almost idyllic. Friendly dinners, public warmth, private respect. At least, that's how it looked. But here's what most people don't understand. In elite circles, generosity often comes with unspoken expectations. Not control, not ownership, but responsibility. If someone steps in to help you during a vulnerable transition, financially, strategically, emotionally, there's an assumption that you'll handle your side of the arrangement with integrity. And that's where the story quietly shifts. Because at some point, and the exact moment matters, help allegedly stopped feeling like help and started feeling like something owed. Think about that. How often in your own life have you watched a favor slowly turn into an expectation? How often does gratitude fade once someone believes they're entitled? Now imagine that dynamic playing out with millions of dollars involved and reputations on the line. According to people familiar with the situation, there was an understanding. Not charity, not a gift, an understanding. One that included a promissory note. And before you brush that off, let me explain why that word is so important. A promissory note isn't just paper. It's acknowledgement. It's someone saying, I know this matters. I will make this right. So ask yourself this. What happens when the note exists, but the repayment never comes? At first, nothing dramatic. No accusations. No ultimatums. Just patience. Then polite follow-ups. Then time. And then silence. And silence, when money is involved, creates tension faster than confrontation ever could. Because now the question isn't, when will this be paid? The question becomes, why is this being ignored? And here's where the emotional temperature of this story rises. People close to the situation describe a pattern. Messages acknowledged but not answered. Plans postponed. Conversations redirected. Always later. Always soon. Always not now. Let me ask you something honestly. How many times does later have to be said before it stops meaning anything? At what point does patience turn into insult? For someone like David Foster, a man whose word is his currency, being brushed aside is not just frustrating. It's disrespectful. And that's when things reportedly began to change. Not publicly, but perceptibly. Invitations stopped. Conversations shortened. Warmth cooled. And the most telling sign? Prince Harry, once welcomed warmly into that inner circle, allegedly found himself increasingly peripheral. Now think about that dynamic. If you're David Foster and you believe you've been wronged, do you confront the husband? Or do you recognize where the decision-making power actually lies? Because this is where loyalty becomes complicated. Prince Harry may not have signed any note, but he stood beside someone who allegedly did. So where does responsibility fall? And how long do you tolerate avoidance before you decide that the relationship itself is the liability? This is not about shouting matches. This is about erosion. Trust eroding. Respect eroding. Patience eroding. Until one day, the phone stops ringing. No explanation. No dramatic exit. Just distance. And in elite circles, distance is a message. But here's the twist. The breaking point didn't come when the money wasn't repaid. It came when the situation was finally named. According to insiders, the moment the words unpaid promissory note were spoken aloud, something irreversible happened. Because once a situation is named, it can no longer be hidden behind politeness. And for someone like David Foster, who values principle over proximity, that was the moment he chose self-respect over access. Cutting ties with Prince Harry wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries. And that decision sent shockwaves far beyond what anyone expected. Because when someone with his reach quietly withdraws, others notice. Doors don't slam. They simply stop opening. And that leads us to the real reason this story matters now. Not because of money, but because of what happens when powerful people decide they're done absorbing disrespect in silence. Because if this was just about a debt, it could have been fixed. What can't be fixed is the realization that someone believes they don't owe you accountability. And once that realization sets in, relationships don't recover. They end. Quietly. Completely. And here's the chilling part. If this much fallout happened before the story ever reached the public, what else unraveled behind the scenes? Because the unpaid note wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And what came next would permanently reshape how certain doors closed and why they may never open again. What kind of man walks away from royalty without flinching? Not because he has to, not because he's desperate, but because, in his mind, the equation no longer balances. That question sits at the center of everything that follows. Because before we can understand why ties were cut, before we can understand why silence replaced warmth, before we can understand why a relationship once described as friendly, even supportive, suddenly evaporated, we have to understand the man who did the walking away. And here's the first contradiction that matters. David Foster has spent his entire career in the spotlight without ever chasing it. Think about that for a moment. In an industry built on ego, attention, and public validation, David Foster became one of the most powerful figures in music by doing the opposite of what everyone else does. He stayed behind the scenes. He let others take bows. He built reputations instead of headlines. And that's not an accident. People like him don't rise because they shout. They rise because people trust them, trust their word, trust their discretion, trust that when they commit to something, they mean it. And that trust is the real currency here. Because once you understand how seriously David Foster takes trust, the rest of this story becomes far more unsettling. Let's rewind further back than most people ever bother to. David Foster didn't grow up surrounded by privilege. He didn't inherit influence. He built everything he has through consistency, reliability, and one simple principle. If you say you'll do something, you do it. That sounds basic, almost boring. But in elite circles, it's rare. Especially when money enters the picture. Over the decades, Foster became known for something incredibly specific. He is generous, but not careless. He is supportive, but not naive. He helps people, but he expects accountability. That's the line most people miss. To outsiders, generosity looks like limitless kindness. To insiders, generosity is a test. A test of character. A test of follow-through. A test of whether someone understands the difference between help and entitlement. And here's where things start to feel uncomfortable. Because according to people who have worked with him for decades, David Foster has one hard rule. You don't waste his time. You don't misuse his trust. And you never put him in a position where he feels taken for granted. Why? Because his reputation isn't just professional. It's personal. Every bridge he builds reflects on him. Every person he vouches for becomes an extension of his judgment. So when he introduces you, supports you, or stands behind you during a critical moment, he's staking his name on your behavior. Now ask yourself this. What happens when someone he's backed stops behaving in a way he can defend? What happens when the math stops making sense? Because here's another truth people don't like to admit. At the highest levels of influence, nobody keeps score out loud. There's no ledger, no reminders, no hey, just checking in emails. There's memory. And memory keeps everything. David Foster has seen countless people rise and fall. He's seen fame warp behavior. He's seen gratitude fade into expectation. And each time, the pattern is the same. The person who forgets where the support came from is always shocked when it disappears. Which brings us to the Sussex connection. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle entered Hollywood's inner circles, there was curiosity. There was sympathy. There was opportunity. And for someone like David Foster, that moment likely looked familiar. A high-profile transition. A vulnerable period. A couple redefining themselves outside a rigid system. That's the exact moment when people like him sometimes step in. Not to rescue, not to control, but to steady the ground. To open doors quietly. To offer guidance without spectacle. And here's where perception and reality begin to diverge. From the outside, everything looked friendly. Public warmth. Supportive quotes. Shared events. But behind the scenes, relationships like this are rarely casual. They're built on understanding. Understanding that help is not a blank check. Understanding that favors are not permanent. Understanding that respect flows both ways. Now here's a question I want you to think about honestly. Have you ever helped someone during a difficult moment, only to realize later that they started seeing your help as something you owed them? It's subtle at first. They stop saying thank you. They stop acknowledging the effort. They start assuming your availability. And eventually, they stop feeling accountable. That's not speculation. That's human behavior. And according to people familiar with how this relationship unfolded, something like that shift began to occur. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Gradually. A change in tone. A change in responsiveness. A change in expectations. And this is critical. David Foster is not someone who reacts emotionally in the moment. He observes. He waits. He gives people room to correct course. Which is why the early stages of this alleged tension didn't result in confrontation. They resulted in patience. Patience that most people would never even notice. Because while outsiders saw normal interactions, insiders noticed something else. Follow-through started slipping. Commitments became vague. Clear answers were replaced with soft deflections. Always later. Always soon. Always after this next thing. And here's the contradiction that begins to matter. Publicly, there were messages about integrity, truth, and accountability. Privately, there was avoidance. Now let me be clear about something. Avoidance is not the same as refusal. Refusal is honest. Avoidance is disrespectful. And people like David Foster know the difference instantly. Because if you say no, the relationship can adapt. If you say nothing, the relationship rots. So he waited, and waited, and waited. Not because he needed anything desperately, but because he wanted to see how the situation would be handled. Would responsibility surface? Would accountability reappear? Would someone acknowledge what was owed, not just financially but ethically? And this is where the idea of a promissory note becomes so important. Because a promissory note is not about pressure. It's about recognition. It's someone saying, I know this isn't finished. I haven't forgotten. So ask yourself this. If a promissory note exists, and time passes, and silence replaces action, what message does that send? To someone who values reputation above almost everything else, that message is loud. It says, you're not a priority. And that's where things quietly begin to fracture. David Foster didn't need to shout. He didn't need to chase. He didn't need to threaten. He simply started stepping back, reducing exposure, creating distance, removing himself from situations where his name might be implicitly tied to behavior he no longer felt comfortable defending. And here's the part most people misunderstand. Distance, in elite circles, is not passive. It's intentional. It's a decision. Because when someone like David Foster withdraws, he's not just protecting himself. He's sending a signal that something is off. And those signals ripple. Industry friends notice. Associates ask questions quietly. Invitations shift. And then something even more telling happens. The relationship with Prince Harry begins to cool. Not because of direct conflict. Not because of a dramatic fallout. But because proximity itself becomes uncomfortable. Think about the position that puts Harry in. On one hand, loyalty to his wife. On the other, a growing awareness that someone influential feels disrespected. Do you confront it? Do you mediate? Do you pretend nothing is wrong? And here's where silence becomes dangerous. Because silence can look like complicity. And to someone who values accountability, that matters. Now consider this. David Foster has no reason to jeopardize his standing by exaggerating or inventing grievances. He gains nothing from drama. So when he decides to disengage, it's not impulsive. It's calculated. It's the end result of watching patterns repeat without correction. And this is the moment where the story shifts from misunderstanding to consequence. Because once he mentally checked out, there was no going back. No apology could erase the perception that accountability had been avoided. No explanation could undo the erosion of respect. And that's when the relationship entered its final phase. The phase where the phone still works, but no longer rings. Where the door isn't slammed, it's simply closed. And where the person on the other side may not even realize it's happened yet. Here's the chilling truth. By the time most people realize David Foster has cut ties, the decision was made long ago. What the public sees is the aftermath. What happened behind the scenes is already settled. And this chapter ends with a question that changes everything. If David Foster reached the point where walking away felt necessary, what finally pushed him there? Because distance was only the beginning. The real break came later, when the issue was no longer unspoken, when the silence was broken, and when one phrase, said out loud, made it impossible to pretend everything was fine. But that moment didn't happen quietly. And once it happened, there was no turning back. So what really happens when royalty collides with Hollywood power? Not the version you see in carefully curated photos. Not the smiling appearances. Not the polite quotes exchanged in interviews. What happens underneath? Because the moment David Foster began to pull back, the shift wasn't just personal. It changed the atmosphere around the Sussexes entirely. And this is where the story becomes bigger than one man or one unpaid promise. Let me start with a question that sounds simple but isn't. What do people actually want from royalty once the crown is gone? Think about it. Without titles and forcing hierarchy, royalty becomes something else entirely. A brand, an access point, a symbol people can leverage. Hollywood understands this instinctively. When Prince Harry and Meghan Markle arrived on the scene as free agents, they weren't just a couple starting over. They were a walking contradiction. Global recognition with no institutional backing. Unmatched name recognition without a traditional power structure. Influence without guardrails. And that combination attracts two kinds of people. Those who want to help, and those who want something in return. Sometimes, those groups overlap. That's where the orbit forms. An orbit isn't friendship in the traditional sense. It's proximity. People circling, offering support, advice, connections, introductions. Some genuine, some strategic, some quietly transactional. David Foster understood this environment better than almost anyone. He's watched it play out for decades. New stars arrive. Power consolidates around them. Expectations quietly grow. And here's the first uncomfortable truth. The moment someone believes they are owed access, the dynamic changes. Because now the relationship isn't about goodwill. It's about entitlement. And entitlement is poison in elite circles. At first, everything in the Sussex orbit seemed harmonious. Supportive statements. High-profile allies. A sense that the couple was being welcomed into Hollywood's upper tier. But beneath that surface, insiders noticed something subtle. The tone shifted. Requests became assumptions. Availability became expected. Support became something that was no longer acknowledged. Just received. And if you've ever been in a Requests became assumptions. Availability became expected. Support became something that was no longer acknowledged, just received. And if you've ever been in a position of influence, you know exactly what that feels like. At first, you excuse it. They're under pressure. They're adjusting. They've been through a lot. But over time, the excuses wear thin. Because gratitude is easy to recognize. So is its absence. David Foster didn't just represent a connection. He represented legitimacy. His presence signaled stability, respectability, endorsement, and that endorsement mattered, which is why the expectations around his involvement allegedly began to grow. Not openly, not aggressively, quietly, subtly, the kind of pressure that doesn't come in words, but in assumptions. Assumptions that he would be there, that he would help, that he would smooth things over. And here's where the promissory note becomes more than a financial detail. It becomes symbolic. Because in this world, money isn't about survival. It's about respect. Paying someone back isn't just settling a debt. It's acknowledging the value of their support. And failing to do so sends a message, intentional or not. A message that says, I don't think this matters. Now let's talk about Meghan Markle's role in this dynamic. Not as a villain, not as a caricature, but as someone who understands ambition, reinvention, and control. Meghan is strategic, calculated, highly aware of optics. She understands narratives better than most people give her credit for. And that's exactly why this situation, if insiders are to be believed, became so volatile. Because to someone like David Foster, avoidance feels dismissive. To someone like Meghan, avoidance may feel strategic. Those two perspectives do not coexist peacefully. If you believe a situation will resolve itself through time and silence, you may think you're managing it. If the other person believes silence is disrespect, they think you're testing them. And that's the collision point. This wasn't about forgetting. It was about prioritizing. And here's where Prince Harry's position becomes painfully complicated. Harry is not wired like Hollywood power players. He's emotional, instinctive, loyal to a fault. Which means when tension arose, his default response wasn't confrontation. It was avoidance. Keep the peace. Don't escalate. Hope it resolves itself. But hope is not a strategy in elite circles. Because while Harry may have believed time would smooth things over, David Foster was reading the silence differently. He was reading it as disregard. And that distinction matters. Imagine being in Foster's position. You've extended support during a vulnerable transition. You've opened doors quietly. You've put your reputation on the line. And now, you feel invisible. Not attacked. Not criticized. Ignored. Which, to someone who values dignity above all else, is worse. And this is where the orbit begins to destabilize. Because when one powerful person pulls back, others feel it. They don't need an explanation. They sense the shift. Invitations stop coming as easily. Introductions slow down. Enthusiasm cools. And suddenly, the Sussex orbit feels smaller. But here's the irony. From the outside, everything still looks fine. Appearances continue. Statements are made. Projects are announced. Yet behind the scenes, something crucial has changed. Trust has fractured. And trust, once fractured, does not regenerate quietly. It requires acknowledgement, which never came. Now ask yourself this. If you were David Foster, how many times would you wait? How long would you tolerate being sidelined after offering support? How many deflections would it take before you realized the relationship had become one-sided? Because insiders say the moment of realization wasn't dramatic. It was sobering. A moment where Foster allegedly understood that repayment wasn't being delayed. It was being deprioritized. And that realization doesn't trigger anger. It triggers withdrawal. From that point on, his behavior reportedly changed. Less involvement. Less availability. Less willingness to attach his name to anything related to the Sussex brand. And this matters. Because David Foster doesn't just open doors. He signals safety. When he steps back, others wonder why. They don't ask him directly. They observe. And observation leads to distance, which leads to isolation. And isolation is dangerous for anyone trying to build influence from scratch. This is where the Sussex orbit quietly began to collapse inward. Not all at once. Not publicly. But noticeably. People stopped going out of their way. Stopped offering unsolicited help. Stopped assuming good faith. And once that shift happens, regaining momentum becomes exponentially harder. But the most important turning point hadn't happened yet. Because until now, everything was unspoken. polite, ambiguous, the kind of tension people pretend not to notice. What changed everything was the moment the issue was acknowledged. Not publicly, not in a headline, but in conversation. When the situation was finally described for what it was. An unpaid promissory note. Those words matter. They strip away ambiguity. They remove plausible deniability. And once those words entered the conversation, something irreversible occurred. Because now, the issue wasn't misunderstanding. It was accountability. And accountability forces a choice. Address it, or own the consequences. David Foster made his choice. And it wasn't about money. It was about refusing to normalize disrespect. Which leads us to the question that sets up the next chapter. What happens when silence can no longer protect anyone? Because once the issue was named, the fallout didn't stay contained. And the next move wasn't made by David Foster. It was made by the industry watching him walk away. What if the most dangerous misunderstanding wasn't about money at all, but about what the money represented? Because here's the thing most people still don't grasp. In elite circles, favors are rarely labeled as favors. They're framed as bridges, as temporary support, as mutual understandings between people who believe they're operating on the same wavelength. And when that wavelength shifts, everything gets distorted. This is where the story tightens. Because up until now, we've talked about distance, about silence, about cooling relationships. The moment help allegedly stopped being perceived as help and started being treated as something expected. Let me ask you something. Have you ever done something generous for someone, only to realize later they never intended to meet you halfway? Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't think they needed to. That realization hits differently. And according to insiders, that's exactly what happened here. Whatever support David Foster extended during the Sussex transition was not framed as charity. That part matters. Charity has no expectation of return. Support does. Support assumes responsibility. And somewhere along the line, that distinction blurred. Now, this is where people tend to jump to extremes. They imagine aggressive demands, legal threats, explosive confrontations. None of that fits this situation. Because people like David Foster don't operate that way. If there was an understanding, it would have been handled quietly, privately, respectfully, which is why the existence of a promissory note carries so much weight. A promissory note isn't something you draft casually. It's an acknowledgement that something tangible is owed. Not someday, not hypothetically, but intentionally. And here's the key contradiction. If the note existed, then the obligation was recognized at some point. So what changed? According to people close to the situation, the change wasn't sudden. It was gradual. At first, timelines slipped. Then communication slowed. Then the subject itself became uncomfortable. And discomfort breeds avoidance. Instead of addressing the obligation directly, the focus allegedly shifted to optics, public projects, media narratives, brand building, everything except closure. And here's where the emotional stakes escalate. Because to David Foster, this wasn't about urgency. It was about acknowledgement. A simple check-in, a clear update, an honest conversation. That's all it would have taken to preserve trust. But that conversation never came. Instead, there were layers, intermediaries, deflections, carefully worded reassurances that didn't actually resolve anything. Always later, always after, always soon. And that's when a favor begins to curdle. Because favors rely on goodwill. And goodwill evaporates when one side feels unseen. Now let's talk about something uncomfortable. Power changes how people interpret obligations. If you believe your status shields you, you may not feel pressure to explain yourself. If you believe the other person will always understand, you may underestimate how much silence communicates. And if you believe proximity alone maintains a relationship, you stop doing the work. That's where entitlement creeps in. Not loudly, quietly. And entitlement doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in what people stop doing. They stop checking in. They stop clarifying. They stop prioritizing resolution. Which brings us back to the promissory note. Because at some point, the note allegedly became symbolic rather than practical. It wasn't about the amount. It was about whether the obligation still mattered. And when months pass without acknowledgement, the message becomes unavoidable. Now ask yourself this. If you were in David Foster's position, how would you interpret that silence? Would you assume forgetfulness? Or would you assume dismissal? Because people who value accountability don't confuse the two. Here's what insiders say made this situation especially volatile. The Sussex brand was built around themes of truth, integrity, and moral clarity. Publicly, there was a strong emphasis on speaking up, on addressing wrongs, on transparency. Privately, there was avoidance. That contradiction doesn't sit well with people who value consistency. Because hypocrisy doesn't need to be intentional to be damaging. It just needs to exist. And for David Foster, the gap between message and behavior reportedly became impossible to ignore. Now, consider the psychological shift that happens when someone realizes they've been deprioritized. At first, there's confusion, then frustration, then clarity. And clarity is dangerous. Because once someone understands where they truly stand, they stop rationalizing. They stop waiting. They stop extending benefit of the doubt. And they start protecting themselves. That's when David Foster allegedly reframed the situation internally. Not as a delayed repayment, but as a choice. A choice to avoid accountability. And once framed that way, the emotional equation changes completely. Because now the issue isn't money. It's respect. And respect, once lost, cannot be bought back quietly. This is where people often ask, why didn't he just confront them? Because confrontation assumes there's still something to salvage. According to insiders, by the time this realization set in, Foster had already concluded that the relationship had become one-sided. That confrontation would only drag him into drama he didn't need. So instead, he did what powerful people often do. He disengaged. He stopped offering support. Stopped extending goodwill. Stopped attaching his name to the situation. And that withdrawal wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. But the most telling moment hadn't happened yet. Because up until now, everything existed in implication. No one had named the issue directly. That changed when the obligation was finally referenced plainly. Not euphemistically, not indirectly, but explicitly. Unpaid promissory note. Those words cut through everything. They removed ambiguity. They forced acknowledgement. And once spoken, they changed the dynamic permanently. Because now, the question wasn't whether help had been misunderstood. It was whether responsibility would be taken. And here's where the story pivots. According to those familiar with the fallout, the response to that acknowledgement was underwhelming. Not outrage, not apology, deflection. And deflection, at that stage, is fatal, because it confirms what the silence already suggested. That the obligation was no longer considered important. And that realization doesn't lead to arguments. It leads to exits. David Foster didn't need to escalate. He didn't need to chase. He simply recognized that continuing the relationship would mean accepting a level of disregard he wasn't willing to tolerate. So he stepped away completely. Not just from the note, from the entire orbit. And that decision, quiet as it was, sent a message far louder than any public statement ever could. Because when someone like him withdraws, people ask why. And the answers don't stay contained. Which brings us to the turning point that changed everything. Because once the favor was understood for what it really was, once the obligation was acknowledged and still unmet, once the silence spoke louder than words, the fallout moved beyond private disappointment. It entered the realm of reputation. And that's when things truly began to unravel. Because the next phase of this story wasn't driven by David Foster at all. It was driven by what happened when the industry started connecting dots. And what came next would ensure this situation could never be quietly undone. What if the loudest accusation in this story was never spoken at all? Because once David Foster stepped back, something remarkable happened. Nothing. No press release. No denial. No clarification. Just nothing. And in elite circles, nothing is never neutral. Silence doesn't mean peace. It doesn't mean patience. It doesn't mean forgiveness. Silence means someone has stopped explaining themselves. And when that happens, the consequences ripple outward whether anyone wants them to or not. Here's the uncomfortable reality most people don't understand. At high levels of influence, people rarely confront each other directly. They observe. They infer. They adjust. And when someone as established as David Foster withdraws without explanation, everyone else starts doing quiet math. What does he know that I don't? Why is he no longer involved? What changed? Those questions don't stay hypothetical. They become behavior. People hesitate. They pause before committing. They reconsider proximity. And that's where silence becomes dangerous. Because it invites interpretation. And interpretation fills gaps faster than facts ever could. Let's talk about how this plays out in real life. When someone powerful disengages, they don't announce it. They stop responding as quickly. They decline invitations they once accepted. They stop offering unsolicited help. And to the untrained eye, that might look like busyness. To insiders, it's a signal that something isn't right. And once that signal is noticed, it spreads. Quietly. One conversation at a time. One raised eyebrow. One interesting comment delivered with just enough ambiguity to spark curiosity. And this is where the Sussex orbit began to feel different. Not hostile, not confrontational, uncertain. People who once seemed enthusiastic now seemed cautious. People who once volunteered support now waited to be asked. And that shift matters more than any public headline. Because Hollywood doesn't punish loudly. It withdraws. And withdrawal is cumulative. It compounds over time. Now think about this from Prince Harry's perspective. He's navigating a world that operates on unspoken rules. Rules he didn't grow up with. Rules that don't come with explanations. So when David Foster's warmth cooled, there was no handbook. No conversation that said, "Here's what's happening." Just a growing sense that something had changed. And when you don't know why something has changed, you're left guessing. Do you push? Do you wait? Do you pretend everything is normal? Most people choose the last option. They hope time will smooth it over. But time doesn't heal silence. It amplifies it. Because while one side is waiting, the other side is already done. And that's what made this moment so consequential. David Foster didn't need to say anything. His absence said it all. And absence at that level carries weight. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone stopped engaging with you, and you didn't know why? Did you feel confused? Anxious? Defensive? Now imagine that feeling playing out on a global stage, where every move is scrutinized and every relationship matters. That's the psychological pressure this silence created. And here's where things get even more uncomfortable. Because silence invites rationalization. On one side, there's a belief that everything is fine. On the other, there's a firm decision that it isn't. And those two realities coexist until they collide. According to people familiar with this period, that collision didn't happen immediately. It simmered. Weeks passed, then months. And still, no acknowledgement. No attempt to address the unresolved obligation directly. No effort to reset the relationship, which only reinforced the perception that accountability wasn't coming. Now consider what that communicates to someone like David Foster. It tells him that his patience is being mistaken for tolerance. And patience has limits. At some point, silence stops being ambiguous. It becomes definitive. And when that happens, powerful people stop waiting for explanations. They move on. This is where the industry whisper network begins to activate. Not maliciously, not dramatically, naturally. Someone notices the absence. Someone else asks why. No one gives a direct answer. They don't need to. The pattern speaks for itself. And that pattern has consequences. Because in industries built on trust, perception matters. If someone perceives risk, they step back. Not because they know the full story, but because uncertainty itself is a liability. And uncertainty was now everywhere. This is the phase where doors don't slam. They hesitate. Meetings take longer to schedule. Follow-ups get delayed. Interest cools. And from the outside, it still looks like progress. Projects are announced. Statements are made. But behind the scenes, momentum has slowed. And momentum, once lost, is incredibly hard to regain. Now here's the irony that makes this story so compelling. Silence was likely intended to avoid conflict, to keep things calm, to prevent escalation. But silence did the opposite. It allowed assumptions to harden. It allowed resentment to settle. It allowed other people to draw their own conclusions. And once that happens, controlling the narrative becomes impossible, because narratives thrive in gaps. And the biggest gap here was accountability. The unresolved obligation wasn't just unfinished business. It was unfinished perception. People wondered, why hasn't this been addressed? Why hasn't this been cleared up? Why hasn't anyone said anything? And when no answers come, people assume the worst. Not because they want to, but because silence suggests there's nothing good to say. This is where the emotional stakes escalate dramatically. Because at this point, the issue is no longer private. It's structural. It's affecting relationships beyond the original parties. It's influencing how others engage. And that's when silence stops being a personal choice. It becomes a strategic failure. David Foster didn't The question became unavoidable. Would accountability finally surface? Or would silence double down? And that moment, that fork in the road, is where everything truly changed. Because the response to that moment didn't just determine the fate of one relationship. It determined how this story would echo through the industry. And what came next would ensure that silence was no longer an option. How many times can someone say later before it stops meaning anything at all? Because here's the moment this story turns from uncomfortable to irreversible. Not when money wasn't repaid. Not when messages went unanswered. Not even when distance set in. It happened when later became the permanent answer. Later is a fascinating word. It sounds responsible. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like progress. But in reality, later is often just a softer way of saying not now, and eventually, not ever. And in elite circles, where time equals respect, later is one of the most dangerous words you can use. At first, it buys patience. Then it buys frustration. Then it buys resentment. And eventually, it buys an exit. Let's slow this down. Because according to people close to this situation, the phrase, "we'll handle it later," became a recurring theme. Not shouted. Not argued. Repeated. Each time delivered calmly. Each time sounding reassuring. Each time postponing resolution just a little longer. And here's the contradiction. Every time later was used, it made the situation worse. Because postponement communicates priorities. If something truly matters, it gets addressed. If it doesn't, it gets delayed. And when months pass without movement, the message becomes unmistakable. This doesn't matter enough. Now ask yourself this. If you were the one waiting, not anxiously, not desperately, but with dignity, how long would you accept that? A week? A month? Several months? At what point does patience turn into self-disrespect? For someone like David Foster, the answer is simple. The moment later becomes a pattern. Because patterns reveal intent. One delay can be accidental. Repeated delays are a choice. And choices define relationships. Here's where this becomes emotionally charged. From one perspective, later may have felt strategic. A way to avoid conflict. A way to manage optics. A way to keep things smooth. From the other perspective, later felt dismissive. A way to avoid accountability. A way to deprioritize responsibility. A way to test how much could be ignored. Those two interpretations cannot coexist peacefully. They are fundamentally incompatible. And that incompatibility is what snapped the final thread of trust. Because trust isn't built on words. It's built on follow-through. And follow-through was nowhere to be found. Let's talk about why this phrase was especially damaging in this case. The obligation wasn't disputed. That's important. There was no argument about whether something was owed. No denial that an understanding existed. Which means the issue wasn't disagreement. It was execution. And when execution stalls indefinitely, credibility collapses. This is where many people misunderstand power dynamics. They assume that because someone hasn't escalated, they're fine. They assume silence means acceptance. But silence, especially from someone who values principle, often means the opposite. It means they're deciding how to exit cleanly. And according to insiders, that's exactly what was happening here. Each, later, didn't calm the situation. It hardened it. Each delay made resolution less likely, not more. Because now the issue wasn't just unresolved. It was being avoided. And avoidance is the fastest way to kill respect. Now consider the emotional position of Prince Harry during this phase. He's caught between loyalty and reality. Between wanting to keep relationships intact and sensing that something is slipping away. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When accountability is deferred repeatedly, everyone around the situation becomes complicit, not intentionally, but by default. Because by not addressing the issue, you're allowing it to persist. And that persistence becomes its own statement. So while Harry may not have been the decision-maker, his presence mattered. His silence mattered. And silence, again, became the loudest sound in the room. Now imagine the internal calculation happening on the other side. David Foster isn't angry. He's disappointed. And disappointment is far more final than anger. Anger wants resolution. Disappointment accepts reality. At some point, insiders say, Foster stopped asking himself when the situation would be handled. He started asking himself why it hadn't been. And that shift is crucial. Because once you stop believing someone intends to make things right, the relationship changes forever. You stop waiting. You stop hoping. You stop investing emotionally. And when that happens, the connection is already over, even if no one has said goodbye yet. This is where later crosses the line from delay to disrespect, because by now, the obligation wasn't just financial. It was symbolic. Handling it would have shown acknowledgement. Avoiding it showed indifference. And indifference is unforgivable to people who value mutual respect. Now here's where the story tightens further. Because according to people familiar with this phase, there was an opportunity. A moment where the situation could have been reset. Not publicly, not dramatically, privately. A direct conversation. An honest acknowledgement. A clear plan. That's all it would have taken. But instead, the same phrase resurfaced. Later. And in that moment, something broke. Because repetition removes doubt. There was no longer any ambiguity about intent. And that's when David Foster reportedly made his internal decision. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. He understood that continuing the relationship would require him to accept behavior he fundamentally disagreed with. And that acceptance would cost him something far more valuable than money. His self-respect. So he chose distance. But here's the part most people don't see. Distance at this level isn't emotional. It's structural. He didn't just step back socially. He stepped back strategically. He stopped being associated. Stopped being a reference point. Stopped being a stabilizing presence. And that withdrawal had consequences. Because once the stabilizer is gone, everything else feels less secure. People around the Sussex orbit began to sense it. Not because anyone told them, but because the tone shifted. The enthusiasm cooled. The certainty faded. And uncertainty is contagious. But the most telling sign came next. Because when later fails one too many times, the issue stops being deferred. It gets named. And once named, it demands a response. According to insiders, the moment the phrase, "we'll handle it later," was challenged, even gently, the reaction wasn't resolution. It was discomfort, deflection, reframing, moving the conversation away from the core issue. And that reaction confirmed everything David Foster needed to know. Because someone who intends to resolve an issue doesn't avoid naming it. They address it. Avoidance at that stage isn't strategy. It's confirmation. And confirmation leads to consequences. This is where many relationships quietly end. Not with shouting. Not with blame. With recognition. Recognition that values no longer align. Recognition that respect is no longer mutual. Recognition that staying would require compromise of principle. So Foster walked away. Not loudly. Not publicly. Completely. And that completeness matters. Because partial distance invites reconciliation. Complete withdrawal does not. Once that withdrawal occurred, there was no longer a buffer. No intermediary. No quiet advocate smoothing things over. And without that buffer, the situation was exposed to something far more unforgiving. Industry perception. Because when a powerful figure disengages decisively, people notice. They don't need details. They draw conclusions. And those conclusions shape behavior. This is where the story accelerates. Because the fallout from "we'll handle it later" didn't stop at one relationship. It altered how others engaged, how others evaluated risk, how others decided whether to step closer or step back. And that brings us to the next unavoidable question. If David Foster reached the point of complete withdrawal, what role did Prince Harry play once the consequences became visible? Because the next chapter isn't about money. It's about collateral damage. And how loyalty, silence, and timing combined to push someone into an impossible position. What happens when you didn't sign the note, but you're standing next to the person who did? That's the question that quietly detonated everything. Because up until this point, the story has revolved around distance, silence, and an obligation that wouldn't be addressed. But Chapter 6 is where the emotional center of gravity shifts. This is where the consequences stop being abstract and start landing on a person who, according to many insiders, never expected to be caught in the crossfire. Prince Harry. Not the Duke. Not the brand. The man. And here's the contradiction that defines his role in this story. Harry is loyal in a world that punishes loyalty when it's misaligned. He's instinctive in a system that rewards calculation. And he's emotionally driven in an industry that reads emotion as weakness. That combination makes him vulnerable. Because when something goes wrong in a partnership, the person who stands beside it doesn't stay neutral for long. They inherit the consequences, whether they earn them or not. Let's be honest for a moment. Prince Harry did not grow up negotiating promissory notes with Hollywood power brokers. He grew up inside an institution where finances were abstracted, handled by others, and rarely discussed directly. Responsibility existed, yes, but it was structural, not personal. That background matters. Because when Harry entered this new world, he entered it trusting the people closest to him to handle the details he didn't fully understand. And that trust became his blind spot. From the outside, it's easy to ask, why didn't he intervene? Why didn't he step in, smooth things over, fix the situation? But that question assumes he understood the full weight of what was happening. Insiders suggest he didn't. Not at first, because from his perspective, things didn't look explosive. There were no confrontations, no angry messages, no demands, just less warmth. And if you're Harry, less warmth doesn't necessarily scream crisis. It looks like busyness, like timing, like normal shifts in adult relationships. Until it doesn't. This is where silence becomes dangerous. Because silence doesn't give you feedback. It doesn't say, here's what's wrong. It doesn't say, fix this now. It just sits there, unresolved, while everyone interprets it differently. David Foster interpreted the silence as disregard. Meghan, according to insiders, may have interpreted it as manageable tension. Harry interpreted it as something that would resolve itself. 3 interpretations, 1 reality. And that reality was closing in. Here's what makes Harry's position uniquely painful. He didn't have the option to distance himself without sending a message of his own. If he pulled away from David Foster, it would look intentional. If he stayed close, it would look complicit. There was no neutral ground. And in situations like this, neutrality is often read as choosing a side anyway. Now consider the internal conflict that creates. On one hand, loyalty to your spouse is non-negotiable. On the other, maintaining relationships that help stabilize your future matters deeply. Harry was caught between those 2 truths, and neither side offered an easy path. People who know him describe him as someone who avoids confrontation until it's unavoidable. That's not weakness. That's conditioning. He was raised in a system where open conflict was managed, contained, and often delayed for the sake of optics. So when tension surfaced here, his instinct wasn't to push. It was to wait, to give space, to let things cool. But here's the brutal truth. Waiting only works when the other side is still invested. David Foster wasn't. By this stage, Foster had already recalculated the relationship. Not emotionally. Practically. He wasn't looking for apologies. He wasn't looking for explanations. He was looking for alignment. And alignment wasn't coming. So when Harry continued to move forward as if the relationship was merely paused, not broken, it widened the gap. Because from Foster's perspective, continued proximity without acknowledgement felt like denial. And denial, again, reads as disrespect. Now imagine the moment Harry realizes something is truly wrong. Not through words, through absence. The calls that don't come back. The invitations that stop. The energy that evaporates. And suddenly, it becomes clear that this isn't temporary. It's terminal. That realization hits hard. Because now, Harry isn't just losing a connection. He's realizing he's being judged by association. And association, in this case, carries weight. David Foster didn't need to confront Harry directly. His decision spoke for itself. By withdrawing completely, he sent a message not just to Meghan, but to anyone tied to the situation. This isn't acceptable. And that message landed squarely on Harry. Let's talk about why this matters so much. In Hollywood, relationships are rarely about one person. They're about networks. When one node disconnects, the network reshapes. And when someone like David Foster disconnects, the reshaping is noticeable. Suddenly, Harry's presence isn't neutral anymore. It's contextual. People begin to wonder, is he aware? Is he complicit? Is he avoiding the issue? Those questions don't require answers to influence behavior. They influence behavior simply by existing. This is where collateral damage becomes real. Harry didn't have to do anything wrong to feel the consequences. He just had to stay silent while something unresolved lingered. And silence, once again, did the damage. Now here's the irony. Harry's silence likely came from a desire to protect. Protect his marriage. Protect privacy. Protect stability. But in doing so, it exposed him to a different kind of vulnerability. Because the industry doesn't reward protection. It rewards clarity. And clarity never arrived. At least, Not in time. By the time Harry may have fully grasped how serious the situation had become, the decision had already been made. Foster was gone. Not physically, strategically. And when someone exits strategically, there is no negotiation. That's the part people struggle to accept. You can't fix a relationship after someone has decided it no longer aligns with their values. At that point, apologies feel late. Explanations feel hollow. Intentions don't matter anymore. Only outcomes. So Harry found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't repair the relationship without addressing the core issue. He couldn't address the core issue without challenging dynamics inside his own marriage. And he couldn't challenge those dynamics without risking internal conflict he wasn't prepared to navigate publicly. So he did what he's always done when cornered. He stayed quiet. And that quiet cemented the outcome. This is where many people misunderstand the fallout. They assume David Foster cut ties with Harry because of personal offense. That's not what insiders describe. They describe something colder. Detachment. A recognition that Harry, whether intentionally or not, was part of a system that no longer respected boundaries. And systems don't get second chances. Individuals sometimes do. But systems don't. Which is why Foster didn't single Harry out for confrontation. He removed himself entirely. That removal had ripple effects Harry couldn't control. Opportunities shifted. Access narrowed. The safety net thinned. And Harry felt it. Not immediately, but steadily. Because when someone like David Foster steps away, others follow, not out of loyalty, but out of caution. And caution isolates. This chapter isn't about blaming Harry. It's about understanding how loyalty can become a liability when accountability is missing. Because sometimes, standing by someone doesn't protect them. It exposes you. And Harry learned that lesson the hard way. But the story doesn't end with his realization. Because once David Foster walked away, the consequences didn't stop at personal relationships. They entered the bloodstream of the industry. And that's where things truly escalated. Because the next chapter isn't about silence. It's about whispers. About warnings passed quietly. About a network recalibrating itself in real time. And what happens when one influential voice quietly signals, this is not safe territory anymore. What came next didn't just change one relationship. It reshaped how doors opened, and why so many of them didn't. Have you ever realized a relationship was over not because someone said goodbye, but because no one called anymore? That's how this chapter begins. Not with an argument. Not with a confrontation. Not even with an explanation. It begins with absence. Because once David Foster stepped away, the most telling sign wasn't what he said. It was what he stopped doing. The phone stopped ringing. At first, that silence didn't feel dramatic. It felt plausible. People get busy. Schedules change. Life moves on. That's how silence disguises itself at the beginning. But silence has a pattern. And when you recognize the pattern, you realize it isn't accidental. It's intentional. This is where the story shifts from interpersonal tension to professional consequence. Because when someone like David Foster goes quiet, it isn't just one relationship that changes. It's the temperature of the room, the environment, the way others engage. Let's talk about how this actually works behind the scenes. Hollywood doesn't operate on official notices. No one sends a memo saying, this person is no longer trusted. What happens instead is subtler. A name stops being mentioned. A recommendation isn't offered. An introduction that would have happened doesn't. And most of the time, the person affected doesn't even realize what's happening until it's already too late. Because the phone doesn't stop ringing all at once. It rings less. Then slower. Then not at all. And according to people familiar with this situation, that's exactly what unfolded. David Foster didn't announce his withdrawal. He simply stopped being the connective tissue. And connective tissue matters. He was the one who smoothed tensions. The one who reassured others. The one who made things feel stable. Once that stabilizer disappeared, uncertainty crept in. And uncertainty makes people cautious. Now imagine being Prince Harry during this phase. He's still moving forward. Still trying to build momentum. Still believing that relationships will recalibrate. But behind the scenes, something is clearly off. The enthusiasm he once felt from certain circles isn't there anymore. The warmth has cooled. And the worst part? No one explains why. That's the cruelty of professional silence. It leaves you questioning yourself. Did I miss something? Did I say something wrong? Is this temporary? And because there's no clear answer, you hesitate to push. Because pushing might confirm something you're not ready to face. So you wait. And waiting becomes another form of silence.